We're back to contrast in Africa. Nigeria, economic power, but with the largest amount of poor people in the world, almost half of its population, more or less 150 million inhabitants, with a large oil daily production. But the state has not administered this resource sovereignly because of foreign companies established there that take away all the oil. The oil industry creates environmental pollutions. Besides that, does not guarantee industrial development. A young democracy with periodic elections, yes, but the corruption darkens governance. It's a complex world that has different relations with Europe, its colonizer, and with the United States that sees in that territory a very good space for hundreds of military bases. Russia, that historically had good relations based on anti-imperialism, and China, that has an economic relation. Nigeria, governance and geopolitics. This is our critical move today. We will look at actors involved and events. In the midst of certain facts of violence, this Saturday, Nigeria had elections for president, vice president, federal parliament, senate, and House of Representatives. The process had to take place on the 16th, but the Independent Electoral Commission postponed this 1 week because it alleged it main authority and lacked technical conditions. More than 84 million people were summoned, and finally 91 political organizations participated. Although in the case of the presidency, the two main options was former General Muhammadu Buhari, the Congress of All Progressive People, president since 2015, and multimillionaire businessman Atiku Abubakar of opposing Democratic Popular Party, PDP, vice president between 1999 and 2007. Once elections took place, PDP talked about fraud and manipulation. As results are coming out since Sunday 24, PDP is at the head. The governing party send high-level authorities to confirm results. In spite of the attempt of kidnapping our democracy and changing the course of history, I must transmit to good people the fact that PDP is about to win the presidency. Therefore, we will remain firm. Let's go to a Nigerian profile in the center of Africa and rises as the main political and economic power in the region. Nigeria, officially Federal Republic of Nigeria, a sovereign country located on western Africa on the Guinean Gulf Coast. To the south, it has the Atlantic Ocean, West Benin, east Niger, and Chad. It is almost 900,000 square kilometers, almost the same as the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, only that 6 times more population. Its population is around 174 million. It is the most populated country in Africa and the 7th largest in the world. It has 36 federated states divided into 774 municipal governments, plus 1 federal district. Its capital is Abuja with 1,100,000, almost 200,000 inhabitants, and the former capital of Lagos with around 13 million. The government is federal presidential Presidential Republic. The president is the head of the state, serves 4-year terms, and may be re-elected a maximum of 2 times. In Nigeria talks at least 500 languages, most live language. Muslims and Christians are the main religions, with a huge capacity of labor and natural resources like bauxite, gold, tin, coal, gas, and especially oil. Nigeria is significant in the continent. On the border of the Niger, it shelters around 30 million people and is one of the 10 most important ecosystems of this planet, but one of the most polluted at the same time. The economy of this country is the largest in Africa, one of the most developed in the world. In 2013, it excelled South Africa in its GDP, although macroeconomic figures conceal poverty and inequality between a privileged minority and a massive group of poor people. We will now go to web pages, 2 with information and 1 with analysis. The latter are a recommendation. The first is One Africa, talks about expectations with the elections. In a press conference, Mahmoud Yakumo, president of the National Electoral Commission, alerted that fake results have been circulating and that no elections have been cancelled around the country, and that the process continues, for which we must wait. He asked for reasonability in the media, where there have been many rumors. President Muhammad Buhari asked the people not to fall in provocations and not to believe unofficial information. It asked to wait for the results announced by the National Electoral Commission. Winning candidates must receive the majority of votes in the 24 federal states. If this doesn't happen, this will be a second term. I now go to Russian agency Sputnik under the title 2019, a test for almost 20 countries. It's not only Nigeria that challenges democracy. Algeria is one of the cases, and it calls Bouteflika enigma. The presidential elections will take place on April 18. All the country is waiting if the 81-year-old president Abdelaziz Bouteflika will remain 20 years more in power. Meanwhile, nobody dares to compete against him, and in spite of his health. We see that another regional power, South Africa, will also have elections next May for the legislative power, and has a waste of the National African Congress that with the president leaving for political scandals. A historic leader of against apartheid will save the party of historic Nelson Mandela. The last web page, which is Voltaire.net, our recommendation. European Union accepts the establishment of new missiles in Europe. It is written by Manlio Dinucci, an Italian geographist and politologist. The presence of China is in essence economic, but the United States and other Western powers, he's talking about Africa, shows increasingly significant military power, and talks about AFRICOM, which is the U.S. military force in Africa that has subordinate commands, U.S. Army Africa, in the province of Vicenza, and U.S. Naval Force Europe Africa. with its general headquarters in Capurichino, Naples, that has ships belonging to the U.S. Sixth Fleet based in Gaeta, Italy. AFRICOM has not created its quarters in African continent, and Germany with France makes terrorist operations in Africa. In exchange, U.S. and French military have privileged access to raw material. This was our commendation. Regarding what we just read, we would like to wonder what happens with oil in Nigeria, what determines so much crude in its territory. We will review this after our pause. Back to developing our critical move today. Nigeria, governance and geopolitics. Nigeria's geopolitical relevance includes its owning so much oil and has two completely different poles, a south that is completely pillaged, and a north, the impoverished rural north that still has terrorist groups as Boko Haram. At the time of its independence from UK 1960, many people were confronting each other. The disputes for dividends by the aid of the 80s, with the arrival of Chevron, Exxon, Texaco, pressed on governments so no competition would be. Less China on the delta of the Niger, a territory that represents 8% of the total country with excellent crude because of its low sulfur contents. Also, GLP, Nigeria produces 2.5 million barrels per day. Today, most of the crude that is imported to the United States come from Africa. Mining and oil exports represent almost 40% of the Nigerian GDP and 90% of the total commerce of that nation. Oil is determined by the great international oil companies and by illegal mafia established in oil pipelines that are not always surveilled. It is presumed that this works with certain political, police, and military complicity. This, combined with money laundering, terrorism, organized crime, drug traffic, and people traffic, has an inequality panorama and has a strike of unemployment of 68%, and most people live with $1 per day. According to 2014 statistics, 69% of the population is under poverty levels, and it has frail states increasing since 2006. Well, Orden Mundial published the curse of black oil, the rob of oil in Nigeria. This is something we have developed in Africa. More than a curse is possession of resources by large international corporations that pillage this wealth without leaving any benefit to the population. What we want to see now is what is happening with the rob of oil. We have Anistad Vasquez, expert in the topic from Spain, who says that the extraction of oil occurs in daylight because the thousands of oil pipelines that take oil to the main refineries cannot be under surveillance, permanent surveillance. They place hoses to extract the oil from the oil pipeline and take it home. You don't need more than transportation cistern trucks, and it is very difficult because the topography of the delta prevents approaching the coasts of oil ships. So oil is taken in small ships to the mouthlets where large ships are waiting. And there's the possibility that the shipment takes place on several occasions during the trip, which makes it harder to identify the place of origin. We now will add analysis from Argentina, Sergio Galeano. He is expert in Africa from National University General Sarmiento. Thank you for being here. Well, going back to elections that we were developing before, we are seeing that two rivals have more opportunity. We will look at the results, both Muslims, more than 70 years old. One says he will end with terrorism, and the other one talks about corruption. This comparison gives us some key facts. Since how political, ideological factors operate in this case. Thank you very much for your invitation. I think that both candidates have different leaderships. The president in office is pitiful, austere, very a faithful follower of religion, while Anuyaka is more a businessman and has many businesses that are not so clear with oil exports, and copies many of the political propaganda of Donald Trump. These are two personal profiles, different kinds of leaderships, but that, at least in terms of program and policies, do not seem to revert the situation of the country regarding the situation of the large majority of the population of Nigeria. It has more than 10% of the African population is Nigerian, and it is calculated that in 10 years Nigeria will have more population than the United States, so it's a great internal market that unfortunately, where unfortunately the majority lives in conditions of extreme poverty. I would like to ask you about democracy and elections in Africa, a continent that tends to be measured and assessed from the outside with patterns that are not that do not belong to them. I think we've talked about this, and they say that democracy has not been well established because we feel that they forget to say that most independence dynamics took place in the Cold War, that there was an imposition of borders, and this leads us to think on the colonial relations with their colonizers. Can we continue talking about the colonial inheritance for this, what some call lack of governance? I think that democracy in Africa, like as in other places of the world, we have to be very careful of universalizing democracy. The case of Nigeria shows two consecutive presidential elections. I think it's better that they have presidential elections than coups. That was a characteristic of Nigeria 30 years ago. when very stable civilian governments were overthrown by bloody military dictatorship. Of course, took over oil investments by multinationals. And for many years, they do have formal democratic elections that, as any democratic process, sets imposition by the same colonizer, so it will hardly be based on pure democracy. In the case of China, we can see the last elections. There were formal elections last Friday, and 1 week before, the Independent Electoral Commission postponed elections for 1 week because of logistics. This shows that the electoral system has some problems. But the elections were performed. The first results were issued yesterday, and we will know. I don't think all the results are concluded by today, but we are looking at the position of both candidates, the current president. In this case, we just have to wait until all the results are issued. What they're talking about is that they have to avoid any military coup by he who loses elections, and this must be avoided. In the case of Nigeria, the slow process calls our attention, but we hope that whoever loses does not ignore results and talks about a coup. Well, regarding oil matters and the transnationals that divides Nigeria in two antagonist poles, an impoverished rural north and resourceful south, even if the benefits do not reach all, and there's a very small industrialization. Yes, the south, where oil is located, is, if you look at official rates, for example, of unemployment, even if the poverty is focused in the north, it's very high in the south too. So we can see that what we could call the richest zone where oil is, young people have trouble finding a job, and the oil has not resolved the problems of unemployment for youth, which is huge in Nigeria. There's very serious problems of young people to access a formal job. Now, Sergio, it's interesting to know how terrorism appeared in Nigeria, Boko Haram. There are several theses on Boko Haram. Some people talk about it results from Islamist groups financed by the United States after the Cold War. and that appeared at the beginning of the 21st century. The truth is that the objective conditions of extreme poverty in North Nigeria make this a good field for the creation or the appearance of these groups. If we add to this the weakness of the Nigerian state in general throughout all the country, access to utilities like electricity and water. Even in the capital of Nigeria, there are strong energy difficulties, even if it has so much oil. The state barely fulfills its role with utilities to the population, and in this context, the speech of Boko Haram, of the terrorist groups, has a space to be heard among unemployed young people. So it is clear that the army has huge problems to repress these groups. They barely control them, and the government barely controls the armed forces. There are military actions that fail because of these problems between members of the armed forces and terrorist groups. So the situation is highly complex, and there are many difficulties to administrate the modern state of Nigeria. Thank you very much, Sergio. It's a pleasure to discuss with Sergio Galeano from Argentina, expert in Asia and Africa. The difference we find in the relations between Nigeria and Africa in general, with the United States, Asia, especially China, and Europe, several of the old metropolises that colonized Africa and are still there with Russia. We will review this in the next part after this pause with our guest. We are talking about Nigeria, governance and geopolitics. Perhaps Africa is one of the continents where this dispute is stronger between China and the United States. And Nigeria is looking at this forcing competition with substantial differences. Washington has a bet on this region, according to the Pentagon, that was filtered to the press in 2015. The United States has around 45 bases around the continent, has an interfering policy for the alleged struggle against terrorism. On the other hand, China is the main African partner since 2015. In January this year, the China and African Union signed a memorandum of understanding for high-speed railroad and roads around Africa. In 15 countries like Tanzania, Ethiopia, Djibouti, Angola, Nigeria, Uganda, Burundi, South Sudan, and Congo. Since July 2016 to 2017, Chinese companies invested in these countries. In commercial transactions, many African countries have replaced the dollar with the yuan, and most of the reserves have been transferred to this currency. Zimbabwe recognizes it as a legal currency, and even if Washington has trouble competing with the low interests offered by China. Last September, South Africa, cooperation forum with China, President Xi Jinping offered $100 billion for infrastructure. It has also been plea for 186 kilometers of railroad between Yaduja and Kaduna. This has a central position in the new route of China. Having compared this context, I present our guest, Luis Paz, Venezuelan internationalist. Thank you for inviting me. Welcome for the first time to Critical Move. I would like to ask you what marks these three actors, China, United States, and European Union, that are in Africa. Most people call them neo-colonizers of Africa. Yes, in the case of the United States, it's important to say that in these elections that are taking place in Nigeria, the United States has played a prevailing role in the sense that it seeks to influence the results. How? In a way that they choose the PDP candidate, Abubakar. This is who is denouncing fraud and manipulation. Nigeria's relation with the United States is based between conflict and cooperation. Conflict is based on the fact that Nigeria and the United States has reported that Nigeria violates human rights because of the conflict in the north with the terrorist group Boko Haram. And these reports of the United States have meant that the relation between Nigeria and the United States be cooled. Nevertheless, Nigeria has managed the United States to help it in the struggle against terrorism. Not only Nigeria, Mali, Burkina Faso, it has affected the region, Cameroon, and the United States takes advantage of this to intervene. Yes, even using the flag of human rights to interfere in these countries. Even before elections, there was a magazine called The Economist that published already the winning of the opponent. This took things to another place because the Nigerian people were tending to vote to what this magazine was saying. In the case of the United States, Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State, has also, together with other countries, especially the European Union and the UK, that was have said that there should be clean elections, free elections, and not subject to any manipulation by the government. This has also affected the relation with Nigeria because Nigeria talks about a concealed agenda with the U.S. intentions, the true U.S. intentions in internal matters of Nigeria, and also their interest in their oil resources. What do these two apparently opponent positions mean? There are differences because Buhari has been a very good campaign, mostly for young people, with social investment. And they plan to take the young vote, 84 million voters. There's a great amount of age population between 18 and 32 years old. But in the case of Abubakar, he is a candidate of the businessmen. He is not. He doesn't come from the popular groups. There are many critiques against this candidate because corruption has been the main arguments against his campaign. We find that in order to favor this candidate, both Buhari and PDP candidate chose very carefully who would accompany them in the vice president formula. In the case of Buhari, vice president is Jamie Asunbahu, the leader of the powerful tribe of Yoruba that has gained a highly ethical image. Although he has been in poor health. In the case of the other candidate, he has Peter Obi, a Catholic from the Igbo ethnic group. We see substantial differences there. To understand Nigeria's reality, we must understand that it is a country that is divided in a Muslim north and southern Christian south. They have many tribes. So the legacy of Great Britain as a colony has affected the political and social situation in Nigeria because we have a south where most of the resources are concentrated, and in the north of the country there is a Muslim majority with very scarce industrial economic development and very few support against poverty. This is how Boko Haram appeared in the northern provinces. It's also important to emphasize on the fact that the distribution of income in Nigeria is completely different. We can find provinces like Port Harcourt or Lagos or the capital of the country, Abuja, where they have a high income, but other provinces like Yobe or Maiduguri, income is very low. So this is taking the groups like Boko Haram take advantage of this in order to affect the government's administration in the north. Regarding Buhari's initiative to confront the crisis in the north, it was increased military support, seek for the support of the border countries like Niger and Benin, and the created forces to take over the borders. But this has affected also because the internal dynamic in Nigeria has turned to that region. In fact, the speech of Buhari before the UN National Assembly, he talked about the Chad River Basin, that is one of the main focus of Boko Haram. Now, the matter of oil and multinationals, something that we developed with Sergio Galeano, I'd also like to ask you. The multinationals in the south of Nigeria that also divide the north and south. Yes, multinationals are more to the south. They say that by 2025, the Gulf that would be the main provider of crude that consumed in the United States, around 25%. This figure talks about U.S. interest in the south development and not in the north because there is no oil there. So multinationals are focused in the south. This also causes a problem because there's a group called Revenge of the Niger River Delta that seeks to have more participation in the South's income, because most income remain in do not reach communities. And we also find that these communities depend on fishing, and oil fishing has oil industry has caused oil leaks and has ruined fishing. This fuels more of these movements to have a participation there. Let's talk about the relations Russia-Africa. We understand there were very good relations during the Soviet Union under the anti-imperialistic principle, and then 2 decades void in this friendship. And since the beginning of the 21st century, there was a return of Russia to African territory. For example, during his official visit in 2009, President Medvedev said that Russia had disregarded Africa for a long time, and that since then they reinstated relations with Russia, with Africa. Yes, in the case of Russia, we must understand Africa. In the 19th century, early 20th, the African country was distributed. The United States received most of the parts when the Soviet Union fell, and the United States started to have an important role in African Union, and then Russia, with President Vladimir Putin, also increased its participation in Africa. In the case of Nigeria, the politics has been more, has tended more to oil industrial systems that are the strong basis of Nigerian economy. There's also interest in developing a military cooperation agreement with the Federal Republic of Nigeria, but I have not progressed because the United States has embargoed weapons because of human rights. So there's a tense relation between the U.S. penetration and Russian penetration. Of course, they clash there. The weight of Nigeria in Central Africa makes almost 300 million inhabitants of Western Africa. Almost 2 out of 3 are Nigerian. This shows the weight of Nigeria in the region. Now, in our recommendation, the article said that the attempts of stopping the Chinese economic progress both in Africa and elsewhere are failing for the United States, to the point that sewing machines that the Italian military donated in Djibouti are Chinese. He's talked about AFRICOM and asks how they have not established the General Command in African territory. Sometimes they talked about Nigeria, Morocco, Congo, and now they are establishing in Germany, then in Italy. But in general, the Africa position is try not to establish that command. Otherwise, they are allowing intervention in internal matters. But we cannot deny that some countries do have military bases, like Djibouti. Gablemonia has around 5,000 U.S. troops. There's one in Niger that is against the struggle against terrorism, and sometimes this is not perceived, but in Senegal in 2016 there were some exercises to train military personnel inside armed forces against terrorism, then Mauritania, and so on. So this will never stop because of the need the African countries of training for the struggle, not only against terrorism, but also organized crime. Nevertheless, other actors are there. Russia is in Central Africa, participating in the unification of the territory, in Libya. So the game the powers have at present is try to control the largest number of countries to control resources. Of course, there is competition between powers. China's position is softer in the sense that their policy is commercial, a win-win policy, very well considered by Africans. When Chinese President won, they signed 20 billion in contracts, and in the Chinese Africa Forum also, they talked about lots of Chinese contribution in infrastructure, which interests the the African people because they are very efficient and facilitates the integration processes, interregional commerce, which is one of the weaknesses Africa has. Much of the commerce goes to the United States, European Union, and China. The idea is to improve infrastructure in order to trade with neighbor countries. Luis, in the case of Nigeria, we read that there was a difference because it broke the colonial institution with Great Britain and chose a political system inspired on the U.S. Presidentialist by timber and with federal states in 36. So its constitution is inspired in the U.S. Constitution. Why? That can be explained by the number of Nigerian migrants in the United States. There are more than 200,000 migrants, Nigerian migrants living in the United States. This talks about relation with Nigeria, and the trade between U.S. and Nigeria is high. Another influence is the fact that the federal state means a distribution of income, the oil income, and other elements of Nigerian GDP, especially the industrial and agricultural sector. Nevertheless, the federal states also implies weakness. Corruption, once income is distributed to a state, they establish the construction of infrastructure, but resources are not equitably distributed in the region. This causes malaise among the people. One of the goals that President Buhari has is stop corruption because it stops Nigeria's development. And this is recognized by several authorities. This is a problem that must be counteracted, and they have established cooperation agreement with some European countries where capitals have been invested to repatriate those capitals for Nigeria's development. Do you agree with us that the curse has nothing to do with having many resources, but because of the pillaging of those resources? Well, the presence of oil resources is a guarantee for power to be interested. We have the case of Haiti. At this time, Haiti has a very serious internal problem with the president that they are trying to get to resignate because of corruption. Nevertheless, the international community has ignored the Haitian situation. Why do they pay attention to some countries and not others? It seems that having resources makes a difference, just like our case in Venezuela with the world's largest oil reserve in the world and other minerals. And another, in the case of Nigeria, in the Niger rivers, Delta has a different geopolitics influences with some countries interested. I don't want to look at it as a curse. We say that we have handled the vision that it's not negative to have the resources, but that historically it has been the multinationals that have pillaged those resourers. Yes, in fact, they don't care that the gap between poor and rich is expanded. The poor people does not even cover basic needs. Regarding these elections, Senegal has also had elections in the midst of conflicts. Is this an inheritance of colonization, or do you agree with us They use foreign patterns to measure democracy, governance, political representation, understanding the amount of ethnic groups and religions in Africa.
David Hell habla de que la gobernabilidad es como
Baby Hill says that governance is a state's capacity to confront society's problems. In the case of Nigeria, there are high levels of unemployment. 20% of the young population is unemployed, and this creates social malaise. Also, the economic situation and the fact that income is not equitably distributed among the states also influences the situation. And a problem can also be presented when, for example, parameters like the established by the World Bank or the IMF, they establish transparency levels or corruption levels in Nigeria that are very high, and this also influences in their development. Many of Africans do not like this because they say you can't bring parameters brought from abroad to the Nigerian state that has different characteristics from the European nations. For example, child mortality statistics or birth rates. There are sometimes methodological differences. Europe measures it in some way, in Europe in another. So this also tells us that they cannot use Western parameters. Thank you very much. Let's go to our conclusions now.